Imagine yourself in this nightmare. What would you do? The cold isn't just biting. It's a merciless predator, sinking its teeth into your very core, freezing you from the inside out until you can barely remember what warmth feels like. You're surrounded by an endless, suffocating sea of snow, a desolate white wilderness with no horizon, no refuge, no hint of salvation. The wind roars like a beast unleashed, slashing at your face with icy claws, tearing through your clothes as if they're paper. You've got no way to call for help. Your phone is a useless brick, your voice swallowed by the storm's relentless howl. Each breath is a ragged, desperate gasp, your chest tightening as the air turns to knives in your lungs. Your steps falter, slower and heavier with every passing second, your body pleading with you to stop, to collapse into the snow and let the cold claim you. You're teetering on the edge of surrender, the fight draining out of you. And then, through the swirling white chaos, a small shadow flickers into existence. A pair of sharp, glowing eyes cuts through the haze, locking onto yours with an intensity that stops your heart for a beat, watching, waiting, almost calling to you. That's exactly the moment Jack was living through. A moment where life and death hung in a fragile, frozen balance. It had all started hours earlier, when the storm descended with a fury Jack had never seen before. He'd been driving through the mountains, a remote stretch of winding roads he thought he knew well enough. But one wrong turn, a decision made in the dim light of dusk, had changed everything. His truck, his trusty old companion, was now a prisoner of the snow, its tires buried in a drift so deep it reached the hood. Jack had tried to dig it out, his hands clawing at the icy powder until they were raw, but it was no use. His phone offered no help either, no signal, no bars, just a blank screen mocking his isolation. With the storm growing fiercer by the minute, he'd made the only choice left. He grabbed his scarf, zipped his jacket to his chin, and started walking, hoping against hope to find shelter or a passing car. But the hours stretched on, and hope withered. The snow swallowed his tracks almost as soon as he made them, the wind erasing any sense of direction. His boots crunched through the drifts, but he couldn't feel his feet anymore. His toes had gone numb, then his ankles, a creeping paralysis climbing up his legs. His hands, stuffed deep in his pockets, were stiff and clumsy, refusing to bend. His face stung from the cold, his lips cracked and bleeding, his scarf now a frozen rag flapping uselessly against his chest. Jack was a man unraveling. His legs shook violently, threatening to give out with every step. His vision blurred, the world tilting and spinning as hypothermia sank its hooks deeper into his mind. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, memories of home, flashes of regret, and a growing urge to just stop, to lie down and let the snow bury him. Every breath was a battle, a wheezing struggle that barely kept him conscious. He could feel his body shutting down, his heartbeat slowing, his strength slipping away like sand through his fingers. Death wasn't just near. It was a presence, a shadow looming over him, whispering promises of rest if he'd only give in. And then, just as his knees buckled and he crumpled into the snow, a faint flicker of motion caught his eye. He blinked, his frost-crusted lashes sticking together, unsure if he was seeing things. But there it was, a fox. A small, reddish fox, its coat dappled with clinging snowflakes, its bushy tail dragging low and heavy with moisture. It stood motionless for a moment, a delicate silhouette against the vast, unforgiving white, its head cocked slightly as it studied him. Those eyes, bright, piercing, and impossibly alive, met his with a gaze that felt almost human, cutting through the fog of his exhaustion like a blade. Jack's breath caught, his mind racing despite the cold. Was this real? Or had he finally lost it, his brain conjuring phantoms in his final moments? But then the fox moved. It took a single, deliberate step forward, paused, and turned its head to look back at him. It didn't flee into the storm. it didn't shrink away in fear. It waited, its eyes glinting with something Jack couldn't name. And in that fleeting, surreal instant, he felt it. A silent, urgent message, follow me. So let me ask you one more time, what would you do? Would you trust your life to a wild animal in the heart of a blizzard? Would you cling to that fragile thread of hope, or let doubt pull you back into the snow's embrace? Jack's chest heaved as he stared at the fox, his mind teetering between disbelief and desperation. His thoughts were sluggish, tangled in the icy grip of hypothermia, but a spark flared deep within him, a stubborn, primal will to survive that refused to flicker out. This fox, this tiny, improbable savior, might be his only shot. With a groan that tore from his throat, he pushed himself up from the snow, his legs trembling like a newborn foal's. His boots sank deep into the drifts as he took a shaky step forward, then another, following the faint trail of paw prints the fox left behind. It moved ahead of him, its small form weaving through the snow with a grace that mocked his clumsy, faltering strides. Time dissolved into a blur. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, maybe days. The storm's relentless assault warped his perception until he couldn't tell how long he'd been moving. His body was a wreck. His feet were lifeless blocks of ice. His hands curled into useless fists inside his gloves. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, each one a stab of pain as the freezing air seared his lungs. He stumbled over and over, catching himself on trembling arms, his knees plunging into the snow only for him to drag himself up again. The wind battered him mercilessly, tugging at his clothes, stinging his eyes until tears froze on his cheeks. But the fox never wavered. It glanced back every few steps, its eyes catching the faint light, as if making sure he was still there, still fighting. Jack latched onto that sight, letting it anchor him when his own strength failed, pulling him forward through the white hell. And then, just as he thought he'd reached the absolute limit of his endurance, just as his legs buckled one final time, a shape emerged from the swirling snow. A small, ramshackle cabin, its wooden walls weathered and warped, its roof sagging under a thick blanket of white. The windows were dark, the chimney silent, but to Jack, it was a miracle, a fragile, beautiful promise of survival. He staggered toward it, his vision swimming, his heart pounding with a wild mix of exhaustion and desperate hope. The fox lingered near the door for a moment, its gaze fixed on him, before it darted off into the storm, vanishing into the white. Jack barely registered its departure. With a final, shuddering burst of effort, he shoved the door open and collapsed inside, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The cabin was cold and damp, the air heavy with the musty scent of abandonment. Dust coated the sparse furnishings, a rickety chair, a splintered table, but there, in the corner, stood a small fireplace, and beside it, a pitiful stack of dry logs. Jack crawled toward it, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grip the lighter. He fumbled from his pocket. It slipped from his numb fingers twice, clattering against the floor, and he cursed under his breath, his voice a hoarse rasp. On the third try, a spark caught, and the flame sputtered to life, frail and hesitant at first, then growing stronger as they devoured the wood. Warmth spread through the room, tentative at first, then enveloping him like a lifeline. Jack slumped against the wall, his breath hitching as the heat seeped into his frozen limbs, coaxing sensation back into his battered body. The despair that had nearly swallowed him whole began to thaw, replaced by a fragile, trembling relief. He was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. But then a thought pierced the haze, the fox. Dragging himself back to the door, he hauled it open and peered out into the storm. The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, the wind still howling its mournful song. The fox was gone. All that remained were those tiny paw prints, already softening as the blizzard worked to erase them from existence. Jack stared at them, his mind churning. Had it really been there? Or had his frostbitten brain conjured it, a desperate illusion to keep him moving? He couldn't be sure. But as the fire crackled behind him, its warmth spreading through the small space, a quiet gratitude settled in his chest. Real or not, that fox had led him here. It had pulled him back from the brink. When morning broke, the storm had finally relented. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, the wind reduced to a gentle murmur that rustled the snow-laden trees. Jack stepped outside, his legs still weak but steady enough to hold him. His breath fogged in the crisp air as he scanned the ground. There they were, those faint paw prints, trailing off into the distance, a silent testament to the night before. The fox hadn't been a dream, nor a hallucination. It had been real, a small, improbable miracle that had crossed his path when he needed it most. Days later, in a sterile hospital room, Jack lay beneath layers of blankets as a doctor stood over him, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "You were hours away from death," the doctor said, shaking his head. "If you hadn't found that cabin, the hypothermia would have taken you. Your core temperature was dangerously low. You're lucky to be alive." Jack didn't argue. He just smiled. A small, quiet smile that held a secret the doctor couldn't grasp. Luck didn't tell the whole story. A tiny fox, with its bright eyes and sodden tail, had guided him through the darkness when he had nothing left to give. So what's your take? Can animals sense our need and step in to help us in ways we can't explain? Was this a miracle woven by fate, a moment of divine intervention, or just a wild twist of chance? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below, and let's get this conversation going. If this gripping tale of survival and mystery kept you hooked, smash that like button and hit subscribe for more stories that'll leave you questioning the boundaries of the possible. Because out there, in the wild unknown, the next incredible tale might be waiting just beyond the snow.